It was the kind of silence that doesn't exist anywhere but the high elevation of the Olympics, after the rain has stopped but the fog hasn't lifted. A wet, heavy silence that felt less like peace and more like a vacuum sucking the sound out of the world. That's when the memory hits hardest, not during the chaos, but in the sterile quiet afterwards. I was Ranger Elias Vance, 15 years policing the edges of the wild, mostly dealing with broken ankles, lost hikers who ignored the map, and the occasional idiot trying to feed a bear. I thought I knew the forest. I didn't. The call came in on a Thursday, late afternoon, the kind of day where the light dies early under the canopy. A 6-year-old boy, Ethan Taggart, vanished from a designated campsite near the West Fork trailhead. LOP, last observed point, was right by the picnic table. His parents, good people, just overwhelmed, said they looked away for maybe 3 minutes. 3 minutes is a lifetime out here. I remember the drive in, the smell of wet cedar and the cloying metallic scent of diesel fumes mixing in the cab of the Ford. When I got to the command post, a hastily erected tent cluster usually reserved for controlled burns, the air was already thick with panic. It's a specific kind of panic when a kid goes missing. It's quiet, focused dread. No one yells, they just move too fast, their eyes too wide. We launched the immediate SAR operation, standard procedure. We had the dog teams out within the hour, but the ground was saturated. The rain had been relentless for 36 hours before they reported him missing. That water washes away scent trails like chalk on a blackboard. Grid Sector Delta 4, I barked into the radio, my voice hoarse despite having barely started. Team 2, push the creek line hard. If he followed the water, he's probably stuck in the drainage.
The first 48 hours were a blur of mud, caffeine, and useless optimism. We ran every protocol the book listed. We had choppers up, cutting through the fog when they could, their rotors sounding like angry wasps above the dense canopy. We had 40 volunteers, all wearing high-vis vests that looked shockingly bright against the ancient dark green moss of the old growth. We were looking for a 6-year-old, someone small, maybe scared, maybe hiding. We were looking low, under fallen logs, inside small rock overhangs, near the ground. We found nothing, not a candy wrapper, not a footprint that wasn't already ours, not a scrap of the bright blue jacket the mother swore he was wearing. The forest had simply swallowed him. The terrain itself was the enemy. Olympic isn't just woods, it's a labyrinth of nurse logs, root systems the size of small cars, and elevation gains that suck the air from your lungs. The undergrowth was so thick in places you had to use your entire body weight to push through it. The fog, that damned fog, would roll in fast, dropping visibility to 10 feet, making the most experienced trackers lose their bearing in minutes. On the third day, the mood shifted. Hope curdled into something bitter. The parents were shells. The father, a big man, just sat on a folding chair near the tent, staring at the picture of Ethan taped to the map board. The picture showed a toothy grin, messy blonde hair, and eyes that were too bright. Ethan's eyes followed me everywhere. The official search scaled back. The media vans packed up, realizing the story was moving from miracle rescue to tragedy. The command structure started talking about recovery, not rescue. They started focusing on the lower canyons, assuming a fall. But my gut, the thing that keeps a ranger alive out here, screamed otherwise.
A 6-year-old doesn't just vanish without leaving a trace of disturbance, not even in the deep woods. He would cry, he would push branches, he would slip. The dogs should have caught something, even a whisper of residual scent near the LOP. I went to talk to the parents one last time, away from the official reports. The mother, Sarah, was staring at the ground, clutching a small, worn, stuffed rabbit. "Elias," she whispered, using my first name, which always feels heavier than the title Ranger. "He doesn't wander. He stays close. He's afraid of the dark." "Did he ever talk about anything strange? Any specific place he wanted to see?" I asked, for the 10th time. She shook her head, then stopped. Her eyes widened slightly, focusing on the distance. "The high ridge. He kept asking about the high ridge. He said the clouds looked like they were touching it. We told him it was too far, too steep. The high ridge. That was the Devil's Tooth section. A jagged, exposed spine of rock rising to about 5, actually one who stays close, gets up there alone. It was physically impossible for him to cover that distance and climb that high without massive distress, which someone would have heard. But I was out of leads, and the look in Sarah's eyes, the desperate, drowning look of a mother clutching at straws, was enough. I told the SAR chief I needed to turn to higher elevation trails again, standard sweep. I lied. I packed my own kit, 2 days of MREs, extra water purification tablets, 100 feet of climbing rope, and my heavy-duty survival knife. I left the radio in the truck, only taking the satellite phone for absolute emergencies. I didn't want the bureaucracy of the command post slowing me down. This was going to be a solo recon, off-grid.
I started my ascent at 4 a.m. hours the next morning, deliberately before the sun, hoping the cooler air would preserve whatever faint scent might still be clinging to the environment. I moved fast, pushing through the lower slopes. The fog was back, thick and cold, tasting of mineral runoff and decaying leaves. Every step was a careful calculation. I wasn't tracking a child anymore. I was tracking an anomaly. The lower slopes gave way to the subalpine zone. The trees thinned out, replaced by sharp, unforgiving granite and patches of snow that hadn't melted since the last winter. The silence up here was different, not muffled, but vast and echoing. The only sound was the crunch of my own boots on the frozen earth and the rhythmic, hollow ache in my chest. I pushed for 8 hours straight, climbing nearly 3,000 feet. I was miles outside the designated search perimeter. I reached the base of the Devil's Tooth ridgeline just before noon. The wind here was brutal, howling through the rock fissures, stripping the heat right off my skin. This ridge was notorious. Locals used to call it the Whispering Wall because of the strange acoustic effects the wind created, sounding sometimes like voices shouting just out of sight. I'd always dismissed it as folklore and wind shear. Now, climbing alone, the sound felt less like wind and more like the forest itself sighing, heavy and deep. I started a slow, deliberate traverse along the base of the sheerest cliff face, looking for any sign of scramble marks, a dropped item, anything that suggested an inexperienced climber had tried to get up. I found nothing for the first hour, just lichen, rock, and the occasional mountain goat track. Then, I saw it.
It wasn't near the ground. It was perched on a narrow, wind-scoured ledge about 15 feet above my head. The ledge was barely 6 inches wide, and the cliff face was almost perfectly vertical below it. It was a spot only a climber with gear, or perhaps a large bird, could reach. I rappelled up the 15 feet, anchoring my line to a stout, ancient fir root that had somehow gripped the rock face. When I reached the ledge, the wind tried to tear me off. I secured myself, fighting the urge to look down the 1,000-foot drop. Lying neatly on the bare stone was a single hiking boot. It was small, bright blue, and muddy, the exact color of the jacket Ethan's mother had described. It was a child's boot, size 11, clearly worn. I picked it up. It wasn't scuffed or torn from a fall. It looked like it had been carefully placed there. What stopped the blood in my veins, though, wasn't the boot itself, but the sock still inside it. The sock was white cotton, the kind kids wear every day, but where the ankle met the top of the boot, the sock was cut, not ripped or torn by rock, but cleanly sliced, as if by a razor or a very sharp blade. And the cut section wasn't frayed or dirty. It was sealed with a thin, shimmering layer of what looked like hardened resin or amber, perfectly binding the remaining sock material to the inside lining of the boot. I stood on that narrow ledge, 15 feet up a sheer cliff face, miles from the nearest trail, holding a child's severed boot. My mind raced through the possibilities. A predator? No predator uses a surgical cut. A skilled adult climber? Why would they take one boot off a child and place it here, meticulously sealed? The wind howled, and for the first time, it didn't sound like wind shear. It sounded like the forest was laughing at the inadequacy of my training, at the limitations of my human brain.
I checked the boot again. The sole was worn but intact. And then I noticed the inside sole. I ran my thumb over the padded insert. There was something etched into the foam, almost invisible unless you caught the light just right. It wasn't a word. It wasn't a symbol. It was a series of tiny, perfectly formed geometric holes drilled into the foam in a pattern that looked like nothing I had ever seen. They were too precise, too uniform to be damaged. They looked like code. I clipped the boot to my harness. I had to get down and get this back to the command post. This wasn't a missing person case anymore. This was something else, something cold and utterly wrong. I started my descent, my heart pounding against my ribs, convinced I was being watched. I was halfway down when I heard the sound. It came from directly above me, from the absolute summit of the Devil's Tooth Ridge. It wasn't the wind. It was a single, clear, sustained note, like a tuning fork struck against stone, but impossibly deep. And then a faint, high-pitched echo answered it. A child's voice. Not a cry for help. It was a laugh. A short, joyful, utterly unhinged laugh that seemed to carry no fear, only intense, terrifying pleasure. It faded instantly, swallowed by the mountain air. I hit the ground running. I didn't look up again. I didn't even stop to coil my rope. I ran back down the scree slope, the blue boot heavy in my hand, knowing I had just crossed a boundary I could never uncross. The mountain had Ethan, and whatever had taken him was still up there, playing games with my sanity. I had to get back to the truck. I had to report the boot, the cut, the impossible height, and the laugh. I had to tell someone that the forest wasn't just hiding him, it was actively participating in his disappearance. But as I reached the tree line, plunging back into the dark, wet density of the old growth, I stopped dead.
My satellite phone, which I had secured in the inner pocket of my pack, was gone. I checked the pocket again. Empty. I checked the ground. Nothing. I hadn't fallen. I hadn't stopped. The pocket was zippered shut when I started the descent. My lifeline, my connection to the outside world, had vanished. And then I saw the trail marker. It was one of the orange plastic tags we use for grid searches, tied around a low branch. It was Sector Delta 4, where we started the search, miles away from where I was now. Except this tag wasn't mine. It was old, faded by years of rain, and covered in a thin, dry moss that only grows on wood that hasn't been disturbed for a long time. And beneath the tag, scratched deep into the bark of the old cedar, was a message. Not written with a knife or a pen, but gouged out by something sharp and curved, like a claw. It was just 3 words. We are closer. I didn't need a map to know where Delta 4 was. I was miles from it, deep in the high elevation zone. The tag was a phantom, an impossibility. And the claw marks? They weren't just scratches, they were gouges, deep enough to catch the light, angled upward, pointing toward the direction I had just come from, toward the Devil's Tooth Ridge. We are closer. My training took a back seat to pure, visceral terror. That message wasn't a clue, it was a taunt. Whatever had Ethan was playing with me, guiding me, ensuring I knew I was dancing to its tune. I clipped the blue boots securely to my pack's exterior webbing. I needed to move, but I couldn't run blindly. The forest here was a trap. Every shadow felt heavy, every silence felt deliberate. I pulled my knife, the heavy survival blade, more for the feel of the cold steel in my hand than for any real defense.
I followed the direction the claw marks pointed, back toward the ridgeline, but moving laterally along the base, staying low in the dense firs. I kept my head on a swivel, scanning the canopy. I was looking for disturbance, but the woods were unnaturally still. There were no birds, no small game rustling the damp leaf litter, just the sound of my own ragged breathing and the soft squelch of my boots in the moss. After what felt like an hour, pushing through thickets of rhododendron that clawed at my face, I came to a small enclosed basin. It was a natural hollow, shielded from the wind, where the trees grew impossibly tall, their crowns blocking out the pale afternoon light. The air here was dead, heavy with the smell of wet earth, and something else, something metallic, like ozone or fresh blood, but sweeter. In the center of the basin stood a solitary rock spire. It wasn't granite, it was a dark, igneous stone, polished smooth by time and weather, unlike anything else in the immediate area. It looked like a broken tooth rising from the forest floor. And at the base of this spire, resting on a bed of bright green moss, was the matching boot. The second one, the other size 11, bright blue, muddy hiking boot. I approached slowly, knife ready. This placement was even more deliberate than the last. It wasn't perched precariously, it was displayed, like an offering left at a shrine. I knelt down, ignoring the mud soaking into my knees. The second boot was identical to the first, and inside the white cotton sock was still there, but just like the other, it was cleanly severed at the ankle. The remaining fabric was sealed to the boot's lining by that same thin, clear, amber-like resin. Surgical, precise, impossible. I reached inside the boot, pulling out the sock. The sock itself was pristine, untouched by mud or wear, despite the state of the boot, but pressed into the toe area where the foot would have been was a small, hand-carved piece of cedar.
It was a tiny, rough-hewn bear, the kind of simple toy a parent might whittle for a child on a camping trip. I remembered seeing it in the picture taped to the map board. Ethan's father had made it for him. Tears sprang to my eyes, but they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of pure, cold rage. This was a message of intimacy. Whatever held Ethan knew him, knew his possessions, and was using them to lead me. It was deliberate cruelty aimed squarely at my professional duty and my humanity. I looked up at the dark spire. There was no sound, no movement, just the overwhelming, suffocating silence. "You want me?" I whispered, my voice cracking against the stillness. "Then show yourself." No answer, only the forest waiting. I pocketed the second boot and the tiny wooden bear. I couldn't leave them. They were the only proof I had that I wasn't losing my mind. I turned to leave the basin, ready to fight my way back to the lowlands, when the ground shifted. It wasn't an earthquake. It was a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated up through the soles of my boots and into my teeth. It felt like a massive engine starting up deep beneath the earth, or the sound of an ancient, sleeping thing rolling over. The trees around the basin, the massive, centuries-old firs, began to sway, not in unison with the wind, but in a slow, rhythmic shudder that defied physics. They bent inward, their branches scraping against each other, creating a horrible, dry, rasping sound. The air pressure dropped instantly, making my ears pop painfully. The metallic, sweet smell intensified, becoming so thick it felt like I was breathing syrup. I drew my knife and backed against the stone spire. I felt like prey caught in a tightening net. Then I saw him. He was not in the clearing. He was perched about 30 feet up, nestled in the crotch of two massive swaying branches of the tallest fir.
Ethan Taggart, the blue jacket, the messy blonde hair. He was sitting cross-legged, perfectly still, looking down at me. He looked unharmed, too unharmed. His clothes weren't ripped. His face wasn't scratched. He wasn't crying. He was smiling. It wasn't the toothy, bright grin from the photograph. This was a slow, wide, utterly vacant smile that stretched his mouth too wide for his face. His eyes, the two bright eyes the mother remembered, were now dull, reflecting the minimal light like polished obsidian. They held no fear, no recognition, and certainly no joy. They held only depth. "Ethan!" I shouted, the sound swallowed immediately by the roaring thrum in the ground. "Ethan, it's Ranger Vance. Come down, son. We need to go home." He didn't move. He just tilted his head, maintaining that unsettling plastic smile. He held something in his hands. It was my satellite phone. He held it loosely, dangling it by the antenna, which was bent and broken. "They told me you would come," the boy said. His voice was wrong. It was Ethan's pitch, but the timbre was layered, echoing slightly, as if two voices, one small, one vast and ancient, were speaking simultaneously through the same vocal cords. "Who told you, Ethan? Who are they?" I yelled, taking a careful step forward. The boy giggled. The laugh was the same high-pitched, terrifying sound I had heard on the ridgeline, joyful and completely devoid of human warmth. "They collect the pieces, Elias," he said, using my first name again. The use of my name felt like a violation. "They make us fit." He lifted the satellite phone, examining the broken antenna. "You were trying to tell them," he continued, his voice perfectly modulated, calm. "But the quiet is necessary for the collection." I looked around frantically. The trees were bending further now, their massive trunks groaning under the impossible stress. I knew I had seconds before the basin collapsed, or whatever force was moving the forest revealed itself fully. "Ethan, listen to me. Your mom and dad miss you. We need to go home now." The boy shook his head slowly. "I am home. This is where the quiet things live." He raised the phone up to his mouth, not like he was talking into it, but like he was examining a strange fruit. Then, with a casual, almost bored movement, he brought the phone down hard against the thick branch he was sitting on. The plastic case shattered. He did it again. Crack, crunch. He pulverized my last connection to reality, piece by piece, dropping the fragments onto the moss below. "I don't need the noise," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "I am a part of the pattern now. They just needed the boots, Elias. They needed the feet to be free." I looked down at the two boots clipped to my pack, the surgically severed socks. The implication hit me like a physical blow. Whatever took Ethan didn't want him to fall or to die quickly. It wanted him preserved, collected, and it needed the parts that connected him to the earth, the feet, to be removed for the transformation. I took one more desperate step toward the tree. "I'm coming up for you, Ethan." As I moved, the entire basin reacted. The ground beneath the spire erupted in a massive cloud of dust and pulverized rock. The air was filled with a high-pitched drilling sound, the same sound the geometric holes in the boot must have been made with. And then I saw the shadow. It wasn't a bear. It wasn't a cougar. It was an absence of light, a movement too large, too fast, and too structurally impossible to belong to any creature I knew. It flowed around the base of the spire, briefly obscuring the rock, and then vanished into the swaying trees. It smelled like the ozone and the sweet rot, magnified 100 times. It was cold, deep, and utterly alien. I didn't wait. The ranger instinct, the one that tells you when you are facing a force that cannot be mapped or mitigated, took over. I turned and ran. I ran out of the basin, pushing through the swaying, groaning trees. I didn't look back, I didn't stop to gauge direction, I just ran downhill, letting gravity pull me toward the lower slopes. The sound of the drilling, the rhythmic thrum, and the massive groaning trees chased me for what felt like miles. I ran until my lungs were screaming and my legs gave out, collapsing finally near a small, familiar stream, the West Fork drainage, where we had focused the initial search. The air here was cleaner, colder, and mercifully silent, save for the rush of the water. I lay there shivering for a long time, the mud caked on my face, the blue boots still clipped to my gear. When the sun finally began to set, casting long, bruised shadows through the canopy, I forced myself to stand. I had to go back. I had to report. But what could I say? I made the agonizing trek back to the command post. It was already dark when I staggered into the perimeter. The SAR chief, a grizzled man named Hayes, met me first. He took one look at my face, the exhaustion, the wildness in my eyes, and knew something was profoundly wrong. "Vance, where the hell have you been? You were off-grid for 30 hours, he barked, but his voice softened when he saw the two small, muddy artifacts clipped to my pack.
I didn't mention the vanished phone, the claw marks, the bending trees, or the impossible smile of a collected child. I kept the truth compartmentalized, buried deep where the forest couldn't reach it. I gave the official report. I pushed the Devil's Tooth ridgeline, cross-country, found significant evidence. We were looking low, Hayes. We should have been looking up. I presented the two boots. I explained the incredible height where I found the first one. I explained the sealed cut on the socks. He couldn't have climbed that high, Chief. Not alone. This was placed, and whatever took him, it didn't rip the socks. It cut them, cleanly. Hayes, a man who had seen bodies mangled by bears and crushed by rock slides, looked at the sealed edges of the cotton sock under the harsh glare of the tent light. His face went pale. Forensics will handle this, Elias. We'll send the boots to the state lab. The cut, it defies explanation. I knew what the lab would say. They would find no DNA, no fibers, only the impossible resin and the geometric holes, which they would dismiss as natural erosion or manufacturing defects. They would never be able to explain how a 6-year-old covered that distance or climbed that height. The official conclusion, delivered 3 days later, was exactly what I expected. Ethan Taggart, presumed deceased, likely fell from high elevation cliff face, body unrecoverable due to severe terrain and potential predator involvement. They searched the canyons below the ridge for 2 more weeks, looking for a body that was never there. The parents, Sarah and Mr. Taggart, accepted the grim finality. They had to. The alternative was a terror no human mind could process. I resigned from the Park Service 6 weeks later. I couldn't patrol the quiet anymore. Every sound of wind shear sounded like a laugh, and every shadow in the old growth felt like the edge of that impossible collecting shape. I still have the boots. They sit in a fireproof safe, wrapped in archival paper. Sometimes, late at night, when the coastal fog rolls inland and presses against the windows, I take them out. I run my thumb over the thin, shimmering resin seal and the tiny, precise geometric holes. I know the truth, the one that makes me a liar in the eyes of the law and a madman to any colleague. Ethan Taggart wasn't lost. He wasn't killed by an animal or defeated by the elements. The forest took him, not to destroy him, but to incorporate him. It collected the pieces it needed, and it left behind the artifacts, the boots, as a warning, or perhaps as a twisted form of payment. The quiet things are still up there, in the high, cold places of the Olympics, and I know with a certainty that chills me to the bone that they are not closer to us. We are closer to them, and they are waiting for the next piece to complete the pattern. That is the burden I carry, the memory that refuses to fade, and the truth I told you tonight. Believe it or not, I saw it. I saw the quiet things claim their prize.